Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Liz Brandel. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Morningstar Living, and I welcome you to our Moravian Hall Square campus this morning. Beautiful day outside and a great day to see so many folks coming out for our Eventful Living seminar this morning. So thank you for joining us. So today's program is called Geography, Geology and Genius, and how the coal and canals triggered the American Industrial Revolution. So it's going to be a great program this morning. We have with us Martha Capwell-Fox, and she's a historian and archives coordinator at the Delaware and Lehigh National Corridor. So she is going to focus today, really giving us the whole background to how Pennsylvania was America's powerhouse in the 19th century, supplying the hot-burning, high-energy anthracite coal that ignited the iron and later the steel industry, and how that really impacted this area of the Lehigh Valley. So I would ask you to put your hands together and give a warm welcome for Martha Capwell-Fox. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm really very glad to be back here at Moravian Hall Square. It's been several years, and I've met some old friends and see a current friend at the moment, and I'm sure I'll be able to make a few more new friends. This is, to my mind, an absolutely fascinating story. And it basically is, I'm just basically going to touch on the beginnings of it in a way, because otherwise we could be here all day. And not to do a commercial, but if you're interested in learning the full sweep of the story from the 1790s to the present, this is also the title of a book that I wrote, which the Canal Museum and the DNL published about 3 years ago now, which is available in our museum shop. You can ask Mrs. Ballas about that, or online. So I'm not going to be able to tell the whole story in the time allotted, but I want to tell you some of the most interesting parts of it to begin with. This picture right here, if you are at all familiar with the area of the DNL Trail just a little south of the sewer plant in Jim Thorpe, this was the waylock for the Lehigh coal and the navigation itself. This was where the loaded boats were sent through, where the weight of the coal that was on them was checked and recorded so that the company could keep track of every piece of coal and make sure that they were paid for it when it reached its destination. We're very fortunate to have this. This is a very large, like a 4 by 5 foot color print that was given to us by a man who worked in the mining regulation authorities in the state about 30 years ago. The story begins here with anthracite coal. And let's see, is this a pointer? Oh, there it is, I'm sorry, yeah. The gray shaded areas up here in what is now Luzerne County, Lackawanna County, Carbon County, Schuylkill County, a little bit west. Essentially in this little curve of the Susquehanna River and bounded by the Lehigh. This is the largest deposit of anthracite coal anywhere in the world. It is still the largest deposit of anthracite coal anywhere in the world. At this point, it is no longer economically feasible for a number of reasons to be exploiting it. But when it was discovered at various times in the 1700s, it was so abundant that almost all the discovery stories talk about people finding it on the ground, literally on the ground. And so that is how widely deposited and how enormous the coal deposits were. The thing was that up here was 100 miles from the largest habitation in North America, actually, which was the city of Philadelphia. And there was very little between these two places. And most of all, there was no reason for anybody to go into the business of mining and trying to transport coal. because Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, was entirely covered by trees. And so that meant that nobody really worried about having any kind of alternate fuel source. The only problem began to grow about 1800, between 1800 and 1805, when timber started to become very scarce, because all of this part of Pennsylvania and into central New Jersey had basically been clear-cut. And it takes an acre of hardwood trees to make enough charcoal to make a ton of iron in a charcoal-fired iron furnace, which is all there was here in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey at that point. And a ton of iron sounds like a whole lot until you start making cannons out of it and cannonballs and things like that. So 150 years of European settlement in our area had basically stripped away most of the usable hardwood. It had been used to build houses, to heat those houses, to cook with, to make iron, to build ships in a lot of cases. And of course, farmers came and just simply cleared the land so that they could farm. So by 1800, Philadelphia was experiencing America's first energy crisis. And that led to some of the very first openings of mines, the first one of which was in, this is another map, a more detailed map of the coal regions. And you can see these coal belts are long and narrow. The deposits are very deep, but they're not particularly wide. In fact, this whole area is less than 400 square miles. Is that the right one? No, this is the right one. So without getting into the, go to the next one. Here we go. In 1792, coal was discovered quite by accident by a miller who may have been doing any number of things, hunting, looking for a grindstone, something or another. There's lots of stories about that. And he accidentally discovered anthracite in the roots of a fallen tree. And this led to eventually a group of Moravian entrepreneurs, one of whom was Jacob Weiss, who was living up there in that area in Weisport, and others in Philadelphia. And they proceeded to open this quarry mine on the top of Sharp Mountain in what's now Summit Hill up in Carbon County. And this is an example of how close to the surface the coal was, because they didn't tunnel the way we think of coal mines. They simply dug a quarry. So getting the coal out was a cinch. The problem was getting it in an economical fashion to market, i.e. Philadelphia. There were about 45,000 people in Philadelphia in 1800. It was the biggest city in North America. So that was the market that you were aiming for. But between there and Summit Hill was 100 miles of basically nothing. And the wagons of the day, if there were roads to go across them, only could carry a few tons. So by the time the coal that was mined here in the 1790s got to Philadelphia, it was prohibitively expensive. Then there was another problem, which is that, first of all, anthracite is hard and shiny and looks like a rock, and people didn't even think of it as fuel. It's also very hard to ignite, which makes the not fuel part even harder to get around. And people, if they had been able to burn it, didn't have the fireplace grates or the stoves that could contain the heat, because anthracite burns really, really hot. So a lot of people came and went, lost their shirts, trying to sell coal in Philadelphia. And then, in 1812, these two men, Josiah White on the left, Erskine Hazard on the right, they were both Philadelphians, although White was originally from Mount Holly, New Jersey. He had been in the hardware business in Philadelphia since about 1805 and had made a tidy fortune. He, in fact, had set his life's pattern. He was a Quaker, and he was very diligent about things and very systematic about planning his life, which kind of fell apart at times. But he always seemed to have a backup plan. So he was actually self-taught, and he was a very, very good businessman. He was also an inventor as well as an entrepreneur. And he met the other man, Erskine Hazard, in Hazard's father's house. Now, these two men couldn't have been more different in a lot of ways. Hazard was from a wealthy family His father was the second Postmaster General of the United States and had basically founded the insurance industry in this country. They were quite well off. And unlike White, who was essentially self-taught after fairly what we would now consider elementary education, Hazard had a degree from Princeton, which he had gotten at the age of 19. His grandfather had founded the college, so that probably had something to do with him going there. But nevertheless, he had a very good education. And the two of them went into business together on the banks of the Schuylkill River in a wire and nail business. Unfortunately for them, they did this in 1812, which was the year the United States went to war with Britain, and the British Navy blockaded the coast. And there had been some movement by water of bituminous coal into Philadelphia. It came from two places. One was the mountains of Virginia, where it came down the James River, down the Chesapeake, around the eastern shore of Maryland, up Delaware Bay, and was dropped off in Philadelphia. The other was ballast in ships that came from Britain, which was America's chief trading partner. Well, all of that fell apart, of course, in 1812. And here were these two guys who were in the business of making stuff out of iron, and therefore needed some kind of fuel to soften that iron so that they could make wire and nails, and they were bereft of any kind of fuel to do it. So they bought a load of anthracite that was still sporadically coming down from that mine in Summit Hill. And they put it in the furnace, and they tinkered with it all day, and they couldn't get it to light. We know this because both of them kept diaries, thank heavens, and they also wrote a lot of letters, as educated men did in those days. And they tinkered with it. They could not get it to light. They gave up. They shut the furnace. They sent everybody home and figured this was just a lost chunk of money. So a workman of theirs realized a few hours later he'd left his jacket in the mill, and he went back to get it. This was apparently in cold weather, like November or something, and when he opened the door of the building, it was warm inside. And when he went and looked at the furnace, it was red hot. Now, one of the great mysteries of history is how he summoned Josiah White, and White summoned his workforce. And they all came back and worked overnight on that one load of anthracite, and did a full day's worth of work on that one load of anthracite. So this was actually the first time that there had been a major industrial application of anthracite. Prior to that point, it had been used by a few blacksmiths here and there, as far back as the 1760s, in fact, up near what's now Scranton. But it wasn't commonly used, and only pretty small scale. This was a pretty important manufacturing system. So they realized they were onto something, but it took them another 6 years before they decided to go seriously into the business of mining and transporting anthracite coal. So they first leased and then outright purchased the mine in Summit Hill. Now, one of the things you have to know about Summit Hill is that it's 9 miles from where the Lehigh flows past what's now Jim Thorpe, formerly known as Mock Chunk. It's also 600 feet higher. And so they were first faced with the challenge of getting the coal from up there on the top of the hill down to the river, because White, in particular, had figured out that the only way to crack this transportation issue was to employ water transportation, and that meant the Lehigh River. Now, the Lehigh had its own issues. Anybody who's looked at the river lately, I mean, right now in Humor Park, you could practically walk across without getting your knees wet. The river is so low. And generally speaking, the Lehigh is rocky and shallow and runs pretty fast in a lot of places. In other places, it's deep and kind of slow. So at the time that we're talking about, the early 19th century, the Lehigh wasn't much good for any kind of navigation bigger than, say, a canoe or a raft. But White had an idea of how to tame the Lehigh River and make it navigable. And so, while they were establishing a boat-based building system at the mouth of Mock Chunk Creek, they also went to the legislature in Harrisburg, and they said to the legislature, if we can make an efficient delivery system for anthracite coal, this is going to be really good for the United States. It's going to be really good for Pennsylvania. It's going to be really good for our company, too. Because the reason behind all this thinking was the fact that the United States was 100 years behind Britain and some other countries in Europe in terms of industrial development. And the gap there was the fact that in Britain and some other places, they had been using coal to manufacture iron for a century. And that had put Britain at the forefront. It really was where the Industrial Revolution began, which was in southeastern England on the Severn River in 1718. So this was not what was happening in the United States. We had very little manufacturing base. What there was, of course, the textile mills, the famous textile mills in New England, but they were all water powered. And their machinery was all wooden. And it was seasonal, because you don't get water power when your river freezes. So it was not truly an industrial system. Anthracite was going to make it possible to do year-round, high-efficiency, high-energy, high-production industry. But getting it to where it was could be used was the challenge. So they went to Harrisburg. They said, if you give us the Lehigh River, we know how to make this into an efficient delivery system. And the legislature said, sure. Remember, this is Pennsylvania. Legislature says, sure. Take the river. Take the rights to the land on both sides. Take the tributaries. Take the islands in the river. There are actually a lot of islands in the Lehigh, some bigger than others. Take the water rights. That was a big deal, having the water rights. And they started to exploit that almost immediately. We'll get this river back in nothing flat. Everybody goes bankrupt in this cockamamie coal business. Well, that was 1818. And Pennsylvania got the Lehigh back in 1966. It was the only privately owned river in the United States. So there they were. They had a coal mine up on the top of the hill. They had this little town. It wasn't even a town at that point. It was a collection of boats that they and their workmen were living in, the mouth of Mock Chunk Creek. They did, however, proceed to build a stone road that came the 9 miles and 600 feet straight down from the mine to the banks of the river. This is generally thought to have been Hazard's work, although I'm reading White's sort of autobiography at the moment, and he kind of claims some credit for it without saying that he was the one that figured out how to do it. It was a road with a standard declivity, meaning it made a straight decline without going up and down and up and down. And White says it was the first road in the United States and possibly the world that had no upward angle on it. It was just straight down. So, and it was lined in stone. First efficiency was bring carts down on a stone road. Bring it down here. What they then proceeded to do in 1818 and 1819 was build a series of these low-head dams, 13 of them on the Lehigh. This was White's contribution for sure, because he even patented this. And at this end, usually on the one side of the river, they built a hydrostatic lock. Now, that basically is very simple. It's an opening with a two-leafed gate in the middle of it where they overlap each other. And water from behind the dam is allowed to flow under the gate so that the pressure of the water holds it shut. They would fill boxes, literal boxes, and you can't see it well here, but this is what's known as an ark. These were boxes about 8 to 10 feet square, about 2 feet deep. Each one of them held between 8 and 10 tons of coal in them. They chained them together, and they put one man on the front with a fending pole, another man on the back with a sweep oar, and they lined as many as 20 of these arks up behind the dam up in Mock Chunk. And then some brave soul got out on the dam, shut the water flow off to underneath the gate. The gates dropped, the flume of water that went through the dam carried all the boats over the river, over the rocks in the river, down to the next dam. And it must have been pretty exciting. And it worked. Because prior to that, every attempt to float coal down the Lehigh and get it to Philadelphia had resulted in as much as 75 to 100% losses. They had 75% success in getting coal down to Easton through these 13 dams, and then presumably moved on to, possibly floated down the Delaware, or possibly loaded onto Durham boats and taken to Philadelphia that way. Another one of these lost things that we don't know about for sure yet. But in any case, after a slow start, because they were still having issues with people not believing it was fuel and not having the fireplaces to contain the heat, by 1824, they were delivering over 25,000 tons of coal to Philadelphia at a time. It was a happy coincidence of the development of the right kind of stoves and fireplace grates and a sudden kind of widespread acceptance of the coal. Also, I threw this in just because it's a wonderful illustration of changes in prices and times. Also in 1822, White and Hazard had the forethought to purchase an enormous chunk of land of what is now essentially Hickory Run State Park and chunks of Monroe County for the most part, and also some of Carbon County. They bought 214 acres and 140 perches of land, as it says, situate in Northampton County, because in 1822, all of that was still Northampton County. Pocono Township, spelt with a K. They paid $4.88 for all that land. They paid $10 for that piece of paper that said it was theirs. This is in our collection. I was astounded when I found this. Yes. So pretty amazing. And that was also important because there was still a lot of timber up there above the gorge. It had been kind of out of reach, so it had not been exploited. And another thing that they started to need a lot of lumber for was they also simultaneously to building the two-way navigation, which they began in 1827, they also built the gravity railroad. They employed that stone road, turned it into a 9-mile railroad, which for a time was the longest railroad in the United States, and they began to run wooden coal cars with iron wheels down wooden rails faced with strap iron and started delivering the coal that way, which allowed them to pull tremendous amounts of coal down the hill every day. And at first, wrong way here, sorry. This one, we can't see all that well, but this was painted, this was painted in 1832 by a Swiss artist named Karl Bodmer. And this is also a print that is in our collection. Fortunately, it was a wonderful gift. Bodmer was visiting the United States with a German prince who was on his way to record the Plains Indians, interestingly enough. And of course, he needed a fine artist because there was no photography. But they got stuck on the East Coast for a while. So they traveled around, and one of the places that they visited was Mauch Chunk. And Bodmer drew this as a watercolor to start with. Now, 1832, the two-way navigation, which is what we know now as the canal, where boats could go up and down, had been in business at this point for about 3 years, but it appears that they were still using Durham boats to transport the coal. That was probably because the Delaware Canal, built by the state, badly, on the cheap, took too long, didn't hold water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, wasn't functioning enough for their canal boats that they had designed but had not yet built to carry 120 tons of coal apiece on them. So this was what the operation that they had as early as 1832, and this was really the beginning of large-scale use of anthracite in eastern and northeastern Pennsylvania. Here is Mauch Chunk in about 1860. We're not exactly sure of the picture, the date of this, but here is the bottom of the gravity railroad, which at that point was in the process of becoming the switchback. Here are a lot of boats waiting to be loaded, and quite a few on the river itself. Here's the tracks of the Lehigh Valley Railroad, which is how this dates to post-1854. Asa Packer, whose house this is right here, had built Lehigh Valley Railroad, having no love for Lehigh coal and navigation, directly to compete with the canal as a coal carrier. And this is the entrance to the canal. This dark shadow here, which is a little deceptive, is the first of the 9 bigger dams that they built on the Lehigh between 1827 and 1829 that made it possible to not only always have water in the ditch parts of the canal, which was a brilliant solution to a problem that beset practically every other canal in the 19th century, was how to keep water in it. As long as there was water behind each of these 9 dams, there was water to go into the ditch parts of the canal. And that's one of the reasons why now there are only a few watered sections of the Lehigh navigation, of the Lehigh Canal through Carbon County and Lehigh and Northampton counties, because there are only 3 dams still in existence. And the watered part in Allentown and Bethlehem below the Hamilton Street Dam is entirely due to the Hamilton Street Dam. The watered part of the canal in Hugh Park, which is about 2.5 miles long, is entirely due to the presence of what we still call Chain Dam, which was dam number 8 of the system. And then dam number 9 is still there, not the original dam, of course, but at the mouth of the Lehigh, and that's what puts water into the Delaware Canal. Although, as we were mentioning, it doesn't stay in the Delaware Canal a lot. But in any case, this had gone in 40 years from being a collection of boats on the river where the workers lived to being a town of about 3,000 people and one of the centers of the coal mining industry. This up here is actually the Beaver Meadow coal dump, and that was coal that was already coming by a narrow gauge railroad and being loaded onto the canal boats further upstream there. But, so, they'd established the coal trade. It was very efficient. It got coal not only to Philadelphia, where it could be loaded onto trains. By that point, there was a system that was coming down the Susquehanna by way of some of the Pennsylvania main line going to Baltimore. And the Morris Canal had been completed across New Jersey and made it possible to carry anthracite to New York Harbor, where it then went by ship all over the east coast of the United States. However, there was still no large-scale industrial use of anthracite into the 1830s. Part of the problem was because, again, they had not been able to create machinery, particularly furnaces, that could contain the heat of a large quantity of anthracite coal. This man, David Thomas, was a Welsh ironmaster, and he worked at an ironworks called Inniskedwin in Wales. They happened to be located alongside one of the few anthracite coal deposits in Wales. And the man who owned the works, a man named George Crane, had not only supported Thomas's years of experimentation with anthracite coal, but he had also purchased the patent rights for the hot blast system. So finally, in 1837, he and Thomas together put this together, and the Inniskedwin Works became famous for producing lots of high-quality iron in a very short period of time. White and Hazard found out about this, Lehigh Coal and Navigation found out about it, and they sent Erskine Hazard to Wales in 1838 to buy the patent rights for this process for North America. When Hazard got there, he realized that what they really needed was for somebody to come to Pennsylvania and do it for them. And he began to enter into negotiations with George Crane, and Crane suggested that he talk to David Thomas, which was pretty generous considering that that was his ironmaster. And Thomas was kind of reluctant. He had an established career. He was 40, and he knew that if he ever left Wales, he'd probably never see his elderly mother again. But his wife convinced him that their sons would have more opportunity in the United States, and she was right. So on New Year's Eve, 1838, he signed a 5-year contract with Lehigh Coal and Navigation. And he and his family arrived in Pennsylvania in July of 1839. And in August of 1839, he broke ground on a plot of land alongside Lock 36 on the Lehigh Navigation, on the canal. It was nowhere in those days. It's now Catasauqua. And Lock 36 is unfortunately in ruins. But at that point, Lock 36 was capable of creating enough of water power because of the drop in the canal to power his blowing engine, which is this. This is the furnace for his blowing engines. which was on the ground in those days. What he had to do, and I often think this poor man must have felt like he'd been shoved backwards in history, was they had to build a 24-foot long, 12-foot in diameter water wheel to power the blowing engines. And this is the best we can do of a historic recreation. It was done by a wonderful artist, the late Dennis Gerhardt, who did tremendous research along with Craig Bartholomew and some other people, because there are no images of this. There is only the memoir of Samuel Thomas, who was David Thomas's oldest son, who was 14 when this was accomplished. But in any case, he broke ground in August, and he put the furnace into blast on the 3rd of July, 1840. So 11 months to do this in an area where he had to persuade foundries in Philadelphia to make the equipment that he needed. Then it had to come up on the canals. He was confronted by a workforce that was entirely only German-speaking, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a truly remarkable achievement. Put it into blast on the 3rd of July, 1840, and made his first cast on the 4th of July. And in that day, he made more iron in one day than a charcoal-fired furnace could make in a week. And that was really the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution, because making a lot of high-quality iron in a fairly brief period of time with a lot of fairly cheap and readily available resources was just revolutionary. And this was the first. It didn't take too long for the word to get out in the iron-making community of Britain and the United States. Oh, by the way, this is 14 years later in what did become Catasauqua. By that point, Thomas had built 4 more furnaces and a large house, which is still standing, although you can't see it because his grandson clad the entire outside in black stone and put turrets on it because it was fashionable in 1900. And he had also built an entire town, an entire dry town, or so he thought. But he, one of the first things that he did was to build a good water source, because he figured that men who had good water to drink would not drink alcohol. This, of course, made all the German brewers come running. And there soon became a lot of beer produced in Catasauqua, but nevertheless, he remained resolutely teetotal, and we had anti-alcohol societies in Pennsylvania until, in Catasauqua until after World War II. We also had 15 bars, but so, you know, it kind of evened out. But in any case, I mean, this is the canal here with this large basin, because they had to have a place to unload the coal, and then all came through here, and then here on the, this is the Lehigh. What doesn't show in this picture is the Lehigh Valley Railroad going down the other side. So it's just remarkable how quickly the whole landscape, particularly of the Lehigh Valley, began to change. This is a 20th century picture, actually, from the 1920s. This is the guard lock. This is the best image of a guard lock on the canal itself. It shows the, oops, don't need Mr. Firmstone yet. It shows, this was dam number 6. You can see how it made the river behind the dam deep enough and slow enough for boats carrying 100 tons of coal to ride on the river. Then this part here was where the river was fed into the ditch part of the canal, and this here was known as a guard lock. Now here, this was not a lift lock because the boats came in on the level of the river, and the level of the canal down to Lock 36 remained the same as the level of the river behind the dam. This was a brilliant system, and very, very simple, totally operating by simple machines and hydraulic laws that were known for years and years and years. On the other side here is the Thomas Iron Works. Now this was in a more modern configuration, but it was another one of the anthracite-fired ironworks. This one was actually founded in 1854 by a consortium of Easton businessmen and named in honor of David Thomas, who also had a financial stake in the company, as did his sons. But the furnaces there and the furnaces in Allentown And Copley and Bethlehem and Reading and Easton, rather, were all part of a system that by the Civil War, there were somewhere in the vicinity of 40 iron furnaces on the Lehigh alone between Easton and Jim Thorpe, all powered by anthracite, some of them still using water power as well. In fact, one of the ones that continued to use water power right up through its existence in the 19th century was the Glendon Iron Works, which some ruins of which still exist at Hewmore Park. William Firmstone was an English ironmaster. He was hired by a consortium of businessmen in Boston in 1841. They had a foundry outside of Boston, and they decided that to build their business, they needed an exclusive supply of iron made with anthracite coal. So they sent him to Pennsylvania, and at the advice of David Thomas, he leased a piece of land along the Lehigh Canal in what then was, I think was then known as Southeaston. It became West Easton, then it became Glendon, one of those vague map things. And Firmstone built his first furnace and put it into blast in 1844. By the time this picture was taken in the early 1880s, there were 7 furnaces on this site in what is now Hewmore Park. And if you've been to Hewmore Park, it's a little difficult now, given how green and beautiful it is, and overgrown in some places, to realize that this was once a major industrial site. We like to say, too, that this picture is the microcosm of the entire D&L corridor, because here is the canal. Here are 2 halves of a Lehigh Coal and Navigation hinge boat, one of them still loaded with coal, the other one already empty. There's a pile of coal, the iron works here chugging away, and here in the foreground is the Lehigh Valley Railroad. So this is the whole story of the 19th century in the 5 counties of the corridor. The Lehigh Valley was the chief iron producing area of the United States until about 1870. And then, for a variety of reasons, it began to shift westward to Pittsburgh, which we won't go into. The panic of 1873 did a lot of damage to the pig iron industry, but Glendon, the Crane Works, the Thomas Works, and a number of other businesses did survive that, as well as, well, the panic of 1893 did in Glendon. But both the Thomas and the Crane survived into the years after World War I, actually. However, the next step in this evolution, of course, because there was now an abundance of iron, was the building of railroads. And as I mentioned, this is Asa Packer here on the left, and this is Robert Sayre, who is less well known, but in a lot of ways probably more important, in my personal opinion, than Asa Packer was, despite the fact that when Packer died, he was the wealthiest man in Pennsylvania. Packer was totally self-made. It's an amazing story, and there is currently a gentleman up in Jim Thorpe who is working on the first really comprehensive biography of Asa Packer. He was totally unschooled, entirely self-taught, incredibly energetic. He actually built canal boats. He captained a canal boat. He ran a general store. He built one section of the Upper Grand section of the canal up through Lehigh Gorge, and eventually amassed enough money to invest in what was then the struggling beginnings of what became the Lehigh Valley Railroad. And then from that point, he focused pretty much entirely on the railroad and owning mines that could feed coal onto his railroad. Robert Sayre had grown up as a youth in Mauch Chunk, and also had pretty much the rudiments of an elementary education, but he had the benefit of being exposed to a lot of the engineers who were ongoing work all over that area up there, including Edwin Douglas, who built the Upper Grand section of the navigation. And so at a very young age, he was already an expert engineer. He had helped to reroute the Switchback Railroad. He had helped to expand the Morris Canal. And he was working for Lehigh Coal and Navigation when Packer lured him away and put him in charge at the age of 23 with building, no, 33, I'm sorry, of building the Lehigh Valley Railroad from Mauch Chunk to Easton, which he managed to accomplish in about 2.5 years. And then he was then put to the task of building a rolling mill in Bethlehem so that Asa Packard no longer had to buy his train tracks from his competitor, Moses Taylor, up in Wilkes-Barre, Scranton. So that was eventually the genesis of Bethlehem Iron and, of course, later of Bethlehem Steel. So all the way during the process of doing this, Sayre was not only building and finishing the Lehigh Valley Railroad, as well as the trestle across the Delaware between Easton and Phillipsburg, building the Bethlehem Iron Rolling Mill, luring John Fritz away from the Cambria Iron Works because he had the invention for building doing the most efficient way of producing train tracks. He was also basically building South Bethlehem and founding what became the Cathedral Church of the Nativity, and also fathering 9 kids. So, busy man, amazing person, just kind of the epitome, both of them are, of the energy and the foresight that was common in the 19th century. This is a drawing, which we don't even know the provenance of the very earliest days of Bethlehem Iron. This building was the headquarters, the office, and this was the tracks of the Lehigh Valley Railroad going right through the plant, which is how it actually was until sometime in the early 20th century. So as you can see, it started out pretty modestly for what it became, and also Sayre's probably biggest achievement was in luring John Fritz here on the left from the Cambria Iron Works, where he had invented this 3-high rail system. This is the patent model for it. Basically what it did was it rolled the train tracks in a continuous loop back and forth so that the base was created, the flange was created, and the whole thing was done before the iron cooled, because that was what was making iron rails fragile, was the constant cooling and reheating that they had in the earlier processes. So they paid Fritz $5,000 just simply to come to Bethlehem, which was a heck of a lot of money in those days. And in return, he handed over 20 years worth of patent rights to his process. Fritz, however, was also the person who then brought Bethlehem into the steel industry, into the forging industry with armor plate for the Navy, and then into the making of very large weapons, all of which he devised all of the processes for that. So really, he, again, is another person that not very much is known about, and I would encourage everybody to take the opportunity of visiting the exhibit on Fritz. This coming Sunday, in fact, is the 200th anniversary of his birth in a log cabin in Chester County. And there's an exhibit commemorating Fritz in the National Museum of Industrial History in Bethlehem that's open until the middle of October. Again, another fascinating man who largely had to learn his profession as he went along. Fritz also introduced open hearth steelmaking. He never was a fan of Bessemer and preferred the flexibility of open hearth making. This picture is actually allegedly credited that it was taken by Fritz, which, if so, photography was then another one of his skills, but there's no good reason to think that that's actually true. And then this is a really interesting picture of, first of all, his failed hammer, the 25,000-pound one, I think it was, which was an enormous achievement to build. It was about 4 stories high. Unfortunately, the impact of it threw off the precision of a lot of instruments that were around it, and it shook the entire neighborhood in South Bethlehem, so they stopped using it. So Fritz refined this, by which point he was in his 60s and was still beginning, still learning a lot of things, and built it for making, this is making armor plate for battleships, and you can see here the scale of this machinery when you consider that here are the workmen. So it was enormous, enormous machinery. One of these, I don't think it's this one, but one of these heavy hammers has been moved to the area outside the Industrial Museum. So Fritz was renowned for his genius, and on his 70th birthday in 1892, there was a gathering that was sponsored by the Engineer Society of the United States. It was in Bethlehem at the then Wyandotte Street Opera House. And pretty much everybody who was anybody, with the exception of Robert Sayre, who turns out was actually inspecting the Lehigh Valley Railroad up in Buffalo. But anyway, here is Fritz. Here is Robert Linderman, who was president of Bethlehem Iron at that point, and he was Robert Sayre's son-in-law. This is E.P. Wilbur. And we're not quite sure who this guy is. Even Ken Rainier's not sure who this guy is. However, here is Thomas Edison. Here is Andrew Carnegie. I think this man is Samuel Thomas and his son Edwin. Back here someplace, there he is. That's J.P. Morgan. And there is a overlay picture at NMIH where they have a few more people identified, so we're still trying to work that out. Because here in our collection, we have the scrapbook with all of the invitation cards and the lists of all the people who attended the celebration. You'll notice they're all men. In fact, we also have the card that they sent out from the Engineering Society as a follow-up, which said, "As there will be no ladies present, formal dress is not required." Well, this was 1892. It was in September, so it was probably still pretty warm. This is a 1910 picture of Bethlehem Steel. When Charles Schwab came along in the early 20th century, he continued the steady revolution in steelmaking, and so this is a bit closer to the way some of us remember what the steel looked like. In fact, I think this building is still standing. But a lot of the architecture is quite similar, so it's a little hard to say what is what. The thing is about this area is that with the concentration of natural resources, that's the geology there, the geography, which first of all gave us water power and water transportation, and then a central location for easy access to the major markets of the United States, it also led to the founding of a lot of other major industries, which the Lehigh Valley and or Eastern Pennsylvania was at certain times the leading producer of. And one of those leading producer areas was cement. Man on the left here is David Saylor, who you probably know as basically the inventor of Portland cement in the United States, and the founder of what was originally Saylor Cement, became Copley Cement. And was the developer of the first of the Portland cement plants that was in the United States. The Lehigh Valley is on what's known as the Jacksonburg Formation, which is the best combination of limestones for making Portland cement. It was a geological accident that Saylor managed to exploit. Since then, the cement industry, of course, has developed all sorts of mixes that make cement a lot more versatile in concrete mixes. The man on the right is another rather unknown. His name is Jose de Navarro. And for some reason that I don't understand, this is the only known photograph of him. Despite the fact that he was an extraordinarily energetic and successful entrepreneur in New York, he was Spanish-born. He lived in Cuba with an uncle who ran a sugar plantation. He was educated by Stephen Van Rensselaer kind of remotely. Rensselaer never taught him directly, but sent him all of his textbooks for his engineering school and corresponded with him, so that Navarro basically taught himself. He was in the sugar business in Cuba, moved to the United States, expanded the sugar trade in New York incredibly, built all sorts of stuff in New York, including the first successful elevated railroad, and had a dramatic failure with a massive apartment complex development. And while he was dealing with the fallout from that, he bought a quarry from the Sailor Cement Company in Copley, and proceeded to install the first rotary horizontal cement kiln, which, kind of like David Thomas's furnace, produced way more cement in a short time than the vertical kilns that were actually still in use and are still standing if you've been to Copley. This is not them. This is the original ones. This is a view of Sailor Cement in about 1880. Navarro installed his horizontal one just a little ways up. There's nothing left of what was the original Atlas cement plant, known as the Valley Mill. And Navarro's company eventually became Atlas Cement in Northampton, which then in turn, as Universal Atlas Cement, became the biggest cement plant in the world in the 1930s and 40s. And prior to that point, provided all of the cement for building the Panama Canal. So the industry around here just expanded rapidly and had, of course, you know, the accompanying effects on the landscape. This here is the tops of the kilns that are still standing in Copley. As you can see, they were in a building and they were not meant to be exposed to the elements. And the tops of these were removed back in the early 50s, so what's still standing is only about half the height of the original kiln. This is Navarro's original one at the Valley Mill, shortly before it was torn down in the 1930s. So we do not have any memorial apart from a blue PHMC marker in Copley to note that. Cement, of course, spread all up and down through this area. Nazareth was right behind Copley in developing cement plants. This is one of the Penn-Dixies along 248. I don't remember which one. I believe the quarry is still there in a few of the buildings, but this is all done because, of course, as we know, over the years, the cement industry has basically consolidated into just a few small ones. One other thing that the geology of this area contributed to a major industry was the discovery of zinc in Saucon Valley in the 1830s by people who were actually looking for iron ore. And this was the first zinc plant, pretty much the first zinc plant in the United States. Zinc oxide was essentially invented here in South Bethlehem. Fortunately for the city of Bethlehem, the zinc plant was relocated in the 1880s to Palmerton because it would be pretty awful to consider that the environmental degradation that happened up there on the other side of Lehigh Gap would have happened in South Bethlehem. But this site was this was just a little east of the present New Street Bridge, so you can see that this was something that was completely subsumed by Bethlehem Iron later on. And then New Jersey Zinc consolidated a number of zinc companies, including Lehigh Valley Zinc, and relocated them up to Palmerton. This picture was taken in about 1940. By that point, the navigation on the canal was over, but there were still some canal boats, and basically what they were doing at that point was carrying dredged coal dirt from the river and from the canals and carrying it up to Palmerton, where it was burned in the zinc smelter. This picture might actually be a bit earlier. There are a lot of boats in this picture, and a lot of what is more likely to be anthracite than to just be coal dirt. But nevertheless, this was the last real function of the Lehigh navigation, was dredging and carrying this fuel up to Palmerton. One last example that I won't get into at all. Some of you, I don't know if anybody who's here was here when I did the silk talk, which was probably 5 or 6 years ago. This was the Sackoit Silk Mill in Bethlehem, again on the canal. There were not too many mills that dealt directly with being on the Lehigh Canal. This was one of them. And mills just in general, the presence of anthracite was one of the multitude of factors that brought the silk industry from Paterson, New Jersey to eastern Pennsylvania. The biggest draw of all was a large population of cheap labor, i.e. young women, particularly in the coal regions, but the presence of good water resources, and anthracite coal, which burns really cleanly and without soot. And dirt is just the worst enemy of any textile mill, particularly the silk business. So having a good supply of anthracite coal was another draw. And the Sacquoit mill, which then later was the site of the graphite mill that burned rather dramatically about, 20 some years ago, was a big user of anthracite coal, and it was pretty much delivered entirely by the canal boat. You can see they had their own little derrick here, is coming up. They've already emptied the front half of this hinge boat. It's not quite empty. The back end is kind of low in the water, and here's the back end of the boat, still totally loaded with coal. So they would have just turned around from Bethlehem and gone back up, turned the two sections around, hooked the boat back together, gone back up to Mok Chunk to get some more coal. Silk became a leading employer in the early 20th century in northeastern Pennsylvania. In 1913, the United States became the world's leading producer of silk goods. And that was the same year that Pennsylvania surpassed Paterson, New Jersey as a silk producer, and that essentially meant eastern Pennsylvania. So to drill it right down to the bare bones, eastern Pennsylvania was the largest producer of silk goods in the world from 1913 until about 1930. Yet another example of the leading whatever. Since then, we have an exhibit currently in the museum, which is about the work of women in various industries in the corridor. And one of the ones that we focus on is the Western Electric production of semiconductors and transistors, which was another thing that much later in the mid-20th century was also the world's leading area of production. Finally, this is a picture that was taken in my dad's silk mill in Allentown in the early 1980s. You can see the age of the ladies who were running the looms here. Women who started in the silk industry in the 20s when they were young. Most of them were high school graduates, at least, not all of them. And they basically stayed with it as the industry contracted and contracted. My father closed in 1989 in large measure because he didn't have any more workers. He started to lose loom fixers who were in their 80s. He lost a weaver who was 92. She didn't die, but she lived in Albertus, and she rode in with a guy who was 86, and his wife told him he had to stop driving. So there went two weavers. And as a matter of fact, and I don't have her picture, but my dad's last weaver, Mary Stupis, just died on the 1st of March. And she was 101 when she died. She was Dad's last weaver in 1989. So things have changed. They're not terrible. We're doing pretty well in other aspects. We're probably doing better with not having the coke works polluting South Bethlehem. And so the corridor is pretty much dedicated to the combination of preserving our industrial history and the record of our transportation history, but turning that to modern use that, particularly with the D&L Trail, allows people to connect with our heritage and also with our environment now, and to be able to interact with other people in the environment and with the environment itself. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. I see this gentleman here. Yes.
I don't think of silk production as having anything to do with coal burning, ability.
Well, it was just, okay, the connection, which I did skim over. The silk industry in the United States basically took its biggest hold in Paterson, New Jersey in the 1840s. By the 1880s, their labor market had changed considerably to the point where the original English immigrant artisans were dying off. The machinery was getting much simpler because the machinery was being developed, so it was much more efficient and much simpler. So it was no longer an artisan job, it was a job that could be done by children. And they also had an influx of East European immigrants, and a lot of those folks were skilled silk workers, but they were also socialists. And they started making labor trouble. Well, Paterson wanted none of that, so they started to look for some place with cheaper labor more docile labor, and lo and behold, it was the coal regions. And they started to move up there with the simple things. The other thing that happened, because one of the early mills was actually in Allentown, was when the iron industry started to go down in the 1870s and 80s, there was a group in Allentown that was sort of this industrial development committee, and they started to look for other businesses to lure to Allentown, and they offered them tax breaks and train sidings and buildings and all that sort of thing. And they got the Adelaide Mill, which is still standing on Court Street in Allentown. So it was a combination of the need to replace the iron business, the availability of a huge, cheap workforce. In fact, textiles in general have done nothing for centuries except chase cheap labor, frankly.
But it didn't have to be on water. It could have been on any flat land anywhere.
Right. But the chief fuel, and this one thing I probably should have mentioned, is that by the end of the Civil War, say, anthracite coal was the energy source that powered the entire United States east of the Mississippi and north of the Mason-Dixon line. The reach of anthracite transportation went all the way to the far western end of Lake Superior. The railroads built ships, carried it out that way. And so anthracite completely supplanted any other energy source in the industrial parts of the United States. And
Is Pennsylvania also known, parts of Pennsylvania, for bituminous?
oh yeah.
Just anthracite?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's two different things in two different areas. Pennsylvania's bituminous fields were never as large or productive as, like, say, West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, but they're still there, too. And there's a little bit of bituminous mining left. There's just not any market for it anymore, you know. And the bad thing, too, is that the mines that are still being worked are not generally being owned by big companies, not that they're all that careful either, but they're small operations, and that's why they have accidents.
Last question.
Yeah.
Are there zinc mines under eastern Pennsylvania? Zinc holes
Not that I know of there. The zinc,
anthracite, I understand.
no. Anthracite is totally, Carbon County and further north. The zinc, I think, is pretty much totally confined to the foot of South Mountain on the south side, running along there in the Saucon Valley. And some of those places are still there. But Penn State, Lehigh Valley is on top of one of them. There is, however, going to be a park that's in development. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but it's on the site of one of the zinc mines that Lehigh and a consortium of people are developing. So, yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I grew up down in Robbinsville below Easton.
Yeah.
Along the towpath. When were the mules used pulling the barges up the canal?
And just to repeat that question,
Yeah. Oh, yes.
The gentleman's asking, when were the mules used to pull the barges up the canal?
From the get-go. From the get-go. Mules are the perfect animal to use in that situation. By the way, they're boats, too, not barges. But they have a rudder, they have sort of a keel, and they're pulled. That makes it a boat. But yes.
Down there in Robbinsville presently.
Yes. There's still a lot of the locks along the Delaware more or less intact, which is kind of partly thanks to the state park. And then, of course, just below Robbinsville is that whole power plant that used to power the paper mill across the way. That was why when Lehigh Coal and Navigation handed over the Delaware Canal back to the state in 1932, they didn't give back the Robbinsville to Easton section because they were still making a lot of money on those water rights generating electricity. They went into the hydro business for a while, but it didn't last. So I think I saw one more hand.
Another
Yeah.
question?
Are there any furnace remnants still up at Kansasco of those original furnaces?
No. And unfortunately, the only thing that's left, and I am going to fight to save it, is inside a later building, is the hand-hewn 12-inch square beams that were the framework of the 1840 foundry. This building is threatened by the developer, if there ever is a developer. That's the only remnant of 1840 left. They knocked down, it took them 9 days, they knocked down the base of the last remaining blast furnace, but that one wasn't built until 1920. There's a 80-ton salamander of iron still lying on the ground there that they don't know what to do with, but it's all gone otherwise. There's 3 buildings that were built in the early 20th century, but they're all in terrible shape. So,
Another question?
yes.
If Hazard and Warner had the land rights and the water rights, how did the railroad get the rights?
Well, they did, well, there were some things. They really actually owned like the banks of the river. And in some cases, yeah, Lehigh Coal and Navigation did own a little further inland, and so they had leases. They made a ton of money. That was one of the reasons why everybody else that was in the business basically hated Lehigh Coal and Navigation, because they had this monopoly that had been just handed over by Harrisburg. Yeah. So.
Okay, last question. Is there one more question? I thought I saw a hand.
Nope. Well, thank
Alrighty,
you.
well,
Thank you so
A big
much.
hand together for Martha Catwell-Fox. Thank you, Martha. That was
Thank you.
a fascinating history of the industry and of the area and the industries that came from that. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for coming out this morning. We are happy to be able to welcome folks back for our Event for Living programs. If you have not received your catalogue, there are some catalogues on the table here for any upcoming events that we have in the coming months through December. Alrighty, thank you so much for coming out, folks.